Rhythm Infinity, lesson 1.2.4, rests. So all rests they signify complete silence, and they are actually considered to be rhythmic note values, but denoting silence instead of tones that we learned. So we learned eighth notes, so for any eighth note, there's an eighth note rest. For any quarter note, there's a quarter note rest, etc. And we'll be covering that. And let's take a look at, as a side note, that diagram with that fancy-looking C. That C represents the word common, meaning common time. Common time is 4/4 meter that we learned back in 1.2.3. So first, we're going to learn the whole note rest, and we're going to actually review whole notes. So if you see this next diagram and it looks completely foreign to you, this was covered in 1.2.1. Anyway, in this lesson, we're going to be doing rests. The big takeaway with rests is that you create complete silence by deadening the string either with your picking hand or your fretting hand. I'm going to most likely just be using my picking hand, either resting the pick on the string, my picking fingers on the strings, or possibly muting with my left hand. Anyway, we're going to review the actual whole note first, and then move on to the whole note rest, which is basically complete silence for the same amount of time as a whole note. Here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. All right, in this diagram here, we do have the tablature diagram still. We're using those 6 lines representing the guitar strings. And that black box that's sitting below a line, we're going to say, and it doesn't matter really, it probably should be below that third line in the middle, but I have it on the second line. Anyway, see how it hangs below a line? Whenever you see that, it represents a whole note rest, which means that there's complete silence for 4 full counts. So the whole point of rests is this: you still count, you still tap your foot, but you don't play. The instrument that you're playing, that's what rests, not your counting and not your tapping the foot. For now, we're tapping the foot. But I'm just saying, you still have to count even though you're not playing. That's the big takeaway in rests. And one more very important housekeeping note. On the whole note where we're playing it, after the you want that note to sustain in full past count 4 into the and of 4. Immediately after the and of 4, you need to cover the string exactly on count 1, not before count 1 and not after count 1. So you basically just look at the diagrams. It has an arrow from the rest to the count number, and that's where you cover the string, and just watch what I do on the video, how I handle it, and just kind of copy what I'm doing in the video. You can pause the video or whatever it takes. Here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. You can rewind if you'd like, and notice how I got the rests going by covering the string and making it completely silent. We will now be playing half notes as a review from 1.2.1. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Let's look at the half note rest. So it kind of looks like the whole note rest, except the difference, do you see how it's sitting above the line? So the black rectangle that you see, anytime you see it sitting on a line, it's a half note rest. So that's going to be complete silence for 2 full counts. And at the expense of being redundant, the reason I'm kind of overstating things is because in future lessons, there's going to be less explanation given to where you're expected to know exactly what something is by the way it's notated. And that's why I'm doing this. So on these half note rests, remember you cover the string after the and of one of the half notes is realized. So you let that half note ring out over the and then wherever that rest is, you cover the string immediately on that count. And not before and not after, but right on it. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... All right, let's look at the quarter note rest. It's that weird squiggly looking line. So just as a quarter note sounds for one full count, in other words over one and, the quarter note rest is complete silence for a single count. And particularly in the first measure, this is a 2-measure example. In the first measure, you have the rests occurring on counts 2 and 4. So because the quarter note rest occurs on count 2, you're going to rest a full count, so for 2 and. But remember, you don't cover the string until count 2. So you let that quarter note ring out for the full value of 1 and, cover the string immediately on count 2. And then after the and of 2, you have to come in right on count 3 on that quarter note. And then after the and of 3, you're still letting that quarter note ring out over the and of 3, and then you cover the string on count 4. And I also included that in the notes as I did in the previous examples on the graphics. So here we go. Listen, watch, learn, rewind, play, study. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 look at the symbol for the eighth note rest, which indicates silence for half a count. So just like the eighth note is a tone for half a count, so is the eighth note rest being a rest. In other words, complete silence for half a count. Eighth notes were covered in lesson 1.2, so a review may be necessary. So on these eighth note rests, you'll notice in this first example where the eighth note rest is placed on the ands. So because there's a rest placed on the and, the eighth note rest, you're going to cover the string either with your hand or with the pick so it's completely silent on each and. And then in the following exercise, you'll notice that the one that follows that, the eighth note rest is placed on the count numbers. And in that case, you would rest for those halves of the counts coming in with the pick on the ands. You'll see it in the notation examples and it'll make more sense. And I'm also reintroducing the down pick and up pick symbols, and then where it says the foot, those arrows that are going up and down under the count numbers, that was covered in the very first lesson on timing exercises, in which the symbols for down picks, up picks, foot taps, how to do it, how to set the metronome, all of that. And you can apply all those concepts to these lessons. So if you think that these lessons are too slow, you can set the metronome. These exercises are at 40 beats per minute, but you could set the metronome at any tempo you'd like, so long as you are playing in time and cleanly. So definitely take all that into account while you're doing these exercises. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 we will do a triplet review that was covered in lesson 1.2, and we will be introducing, it's an eighth note rest, but it's going to be within the triplets. So in other words, it'll be a rest for 1/3 of a beat. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. Now we will insert the eighth note rest in the second triplet. In other words, where we say the word trip. So again, with rests, remember, we always count, we tap our foot, but when we rest, we just cover the string so there's complete silence, either with our hand or our pick, but we still count. So although we rest playing-wise, we do not rest counting-wise. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 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 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. All right, now we are going to review the rests and the note values, but in 3/4 time, or 3/4 time. 3/4 time was covered in lesson 1.2.3, which is actually the previous lesson. And we're also going to be reviewing in 6/8 meter, which was also covered in the same lesson 1.2.3. So if you're not familiar with 3/4 or 6/8, when you see these examples, just go back to that and review those lessons, because everything is explained in detail, step by step in those lessons, and then you can come back to this one. And remember, the big takeaway in this lesson with rests is when you see the rest, that's where you cover the string with your pick or your hand so there's complete silence. There should be no notes heard sustaining. And these following examples will be using the formal musical notation manuscript rather than tablature. I did not write any specific note to be played, but I'm going to be playing string 3 open. It's just to get you used to reading actual formal musical notation. And all it is the rhythmic value, so you can actually pause the video and look at the examples and play any note you want and set any metronome setting you want. But for the sake of this study, we're at 40 beats per minute, as usual, and I'm playing string 3 open. And again, you can play along with the video or not. We are going to see the dotted half note again. Remember, dotted notes were covered in 1.2.2 in detail, full explanations, but the short of it is that a dot makes a note longer in value by half of itself. So if you don't understand that, you're going to have to review 1.2.2 because it was covered in detail. Anyway, so the dotted half note, that receives 3 counts. And the dotted half note rest, because you don't have the guitar string lines, you're going to see a black rectangle sitting on top of a short line. It kind of looks like a hat. That's going to be a half note rest, and because there's a dot in front of that half note rest, therefore it's a rest for 3 counts.
And the dotted note concept will make a whole lot more sense if you review 1.2.2. But what I did as a warm-up, I wrote the dotted notes in another way. In other words, I have a half note tied to a quarter note, which makes that 3 counts, and that's the same thing as a dotted half note. And then I have a half note rest followed by a quarter note rest, which makes that a rest for 3 counts, which is the same thing as a dotted half note rest. And here we go with the following examples. Everything will make more sense in the video. I have also taken some of the training wheels off. I'm not including the count numbers. I'm not including the foot tap directions. I am not including any notes whatsoever, just pure manuscript only. In other words, formal musical notation. Because the more that those training wheels are there, the more dependent you get on them. And when you read actual music, it doesn't have any of those training wheels. So you have to get used to reading the actual notation for what it is, which will ultimately make you a more complete and more knowledgeable musician and be able to get musical information a lot quicker and actually translate it into a real musical experience from the paper to the instrument to the audience. 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and. Here in this review of the eighth note rest, the key is to distinguish between a full quarter note value and when there's an eighth note with an eighth note rest after it. In other words, the full quarter note is going to ring out over and then when you see the eighth note followed by the eighth note rest, you're going to cover on the and. That's the main difference. So check this out in this example. I have put a bass line behind it just to kind of give it a little bit more musicality behind it. One and 2 and 3 and 1 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 and 2 and 3 and. Here we go with the eighth notes and eighth note rests in 3/4 time. 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and. All right, here we are in 6/8 timing. I posted what the note values become in 6/8 from when it's 4/4 or in any meter of 4. When it's a meter of 8, in other words, the bottom number being 8 from the bottom when the bottom number is 4, the note value is double. So when it's a quarter note, it's in 4, it's counted as 1 count, but when it's a quarter note with an 8 on the bottom of the meter, it's counted as 2 counts. An eighth note in 4/4 timing is half of a count, but an eighth note in a meter where the bottom number is 8 is counted as 1 full count, and so on and so forth. I have posted the review sheet from that lesson here, but you can also review 1.2.3 as well. So the main thing is to just look at whatever the note values are in this table here. So in 4/4 timing versus 6/8 timing, in 6/8 timing, really, we're looking at the bottom number, the bottom 8, and then we're looking at the bottom 4 of 4/4. So whenever you see a 4 at the bottom, a quarter note is always 1 count. But when you see an 8 at the bottom, a quarter note is 2 counts. It just doubles. An eighth note in 4 timing, in a meter of 4, where the bottom number is 4, is half of a count. But an eighth note, when the meter has an 8 on the bottom, is 1 full count. It doubles in value. So you can look at the corresponding note values. An eighth note, just think of that as an eighth note rest. It occupies the same amount of time. So an eighth note rest in 6/8 timing is a rest for 1 full count. A quarter note rest in 6/8 timing is a rest for 2 full counts. And then the same thing with the dotted notes. A dotted quarter note in 4/4 timing is a rest for 1.5 counts. A dotted quarter note rest in 6/8 timing is a rest for 3 full counts. And so on and so forth. Review 1.2.3 if you have to, and here is the following example.
One, two, three, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, I want to put that last example in the context of when there's a drum beat and a bass line, just so it makes a little bit more musical sense as to what that is. Check it out here. You don't have to play along, but you can if you want to. I'm just doing this for a demonstration. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this concludes our basic lesson on rests. A good logical place to go after this is to 1.4.3 on strumming chords. Now, it's very important to learn how to switch chords in time. There is an intermediate lesson. We learned those 5 basic chord forms in 1.4.1. So we're going to use those chord forms and strum them in 1.4.3 using the rhythms we just learned. However, there is a lesson that's available. It's blocked right now upon a $25 donation to my Patreon. There's a lesson 1.4.2, switching between chords in time, and that is available if you have a YouTube account, and it'll be made visible to you. And it is available for a $25 donation. Almost 10 lessons have been offered for free, so I'm not going to apologize for asking for money for actually offering you something and working hard on it. Anyway, hopefully you've been blessed by this lesson and will continue to be blessed by the information that is here.